Hey everybody, thank you so much for tuning into today's AMA or Ask Me Anything. I'm Keshav. I work on the API product side, the product team here at SmartBear Software.
And my name is Tamil Sanchez, and I work on the API sales engineering team for SmartBear.
And like as the name suggests, AMA, Ask Me Anything. Well, we're here just to discuss all things API. So come to us with any of your questions, concerns, issues. Let's talk APIs. If you have any concerns about Tamil's hairstyle as well, please do let us know. But without any further ado, let's begin.
All right, so we have some questions coming in already. Actually, there's a bunch of them. So why don't we start with this first one? Should I have an API monitoring strategy in place, and why?
That's a great question. I mean, the way I look at it is, APIs are everywhere, but that doesn't mean all of these APIs have the same critical implication for them, right? So you need to ask yourself, first of all, is of all of your different APIs, what are the environments in which your APIs actually have the biggest impact, and the biggest business impact, and also what are some of these APIs in those environments that can actually affect mission critical capabilities of your applications. Once you've identified those APIs and those environments, you need to start thinking about, well, if these APIs fail at any given point, what is the business loss,
Right.
What is the opportunity cost for that? And if you have substantial opportunity cost associated with that, that's when you know that you need to have an API monitoring strategy in place. Because what is API monitoring? The ability to make sure that the API functions.
That's right, making sure that they're up and running at mission critical times. For example, if you have APIs that are exposed for real retail purposes, right? You want to make sure that on those key dates like Black Friday and Christmas, that they're going to withstand, the amount of scale that they're meant for. It's also very important to think about structure and reusability. So if you have frameworks for testing, you should think about being able to reuse those frameworks for also continuously monitoring.
Got it. Yep.
So there's a bunch of questions here. Just like always, we really appreciate everybody's part in this. Another question that I have here: what are some practical recommendations for making my APIs easier to consume? That's actually a great question, right? APIs are meant to be usable, reusable, and being able to integrate them into different applications. So it's really important to have a very good strategy so that when developers go and try to use your API, that they're easy to understand. One thing that we really recommend is Swagger, right? Swagger allows you to structure a very structured documentation, so that APIs can be consumed easily.
Yeah, and I'll add some more insights into that. Is most people, when they think about their APIs, they think of it as, just like, let's just expose some data and be done with it. But in today's hyper competitive economy, you need to be thinking about the long term, right? And APIs are the foundation for your long term product and business strategy, because they're connecting different applications and products together. So I would always recommend that always have a consumer mindset to your APIs. Even if it's an internal API, they're still being consumed by your developers, right? And as you build your API product strategy and your product portfolio in general, your APIs need to be scaling automatically with your product scale, with the scalability of your products, and also you need to have that consumer mindset. So frameworks like, as Tamil mentioned, like the Open API 3.0 really helps, and Swagger 2.0 really helps you define those APIs. Some tooling, automated open source API tooling for documentation like the Swagger UI can actually help you, for example, generate beautiful interactive documentation that enables consumers to understand your APIs better, be it external facing or even internal facing as well.
So Sager, hopefully I'm pronouncing your name correctly, is asking what is the basic difference between SOAP and REST APIs? Well, if we take into account, the change of API during the last decade, we see that initially it was difficult to interact with the service, right? A SOAP service, it was really rigid, and it needed to follow a very particular structure in order for servers to be able to communicate with each other and understand the messages. With that came a lot. Also, with that rigidness came very strong security natively because of how SOAP services were structured. Over time, we've seen that we had the need to better integrate services, and that's when RESTful came along. Right, as its name implicates, being able to be stateless. And with that came also the need for easier integrations, and that's what REST is all about, is easier integrate via HTTP verbs, very simple, very straightforward. But at the beginning, there was also some challenges with security. So that's where we've seen some extra layers of security being implemented, like OAuth and other types of authentication. What do you think, Keshav?
I think you've hit all the right points, right? Because at the end of the day, both of these architectural styles are built on existing protocols, and REST is built on the HTTP protocol. And the cool thing about REST, I've worked a lot more closely with REST, and I'm sure Tamil has worked more with like SOAP and REST in the same time.
Yeah.
Personally, for me, like I love the advantage that the HTTP protocol brings to the table, because HTTP is robust by itself, and it brings some really cool capabilities right out of the box. And so it just makes it easier to get started with REST APIs, I would say, and especially given we have such great tooling that's built by the community and some great organizations as well invested in the API economy. It just makes it's a pretty exciting space to be in, and personally, I've found a lot of value in the REST ecosystem.
Yeah, I agree, and luckily that we do have those extra secure layers now as well to secure our APIs. Another question that we have here is most common protocols in API industry, and what are their use cases? So do you want to start with that, Keshav?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's a great question. I think Tim asked that question, which is what the most common protocols. I mean, again, like we mentioned, right? There's HTTP, and then there's SMTP, and there's all of these different protocols, and that's the underlying layer between REST, SOAP, and now there's also GraphQL coming up. I would really say that you need to think about not just your end business use case of like why you're building this API and what these protocols can bring to the table, but also your comfort level. There's a lot of times managers, dev managers, senior architects, I feel personally that they might forget the fact that there's also cultural implication when using these protocols. Look at your employees right now, look at your team members, and ask them how comfortable you are in using some of these different protocols. Just based on that, you can also like make certain judgment decisions as well.
That's right, and I would also put in there the need and the actual use case of the actual API, right? Obviously, if you need to send emails, you're not going to use anything but SMTP. If you need to, build out rigidness off of protocols that have already been existing in like financial institutions, you won't move away from SOAP, right? If you want easy interactions to expose your APIs, easy ways of communicating, you'll use REST. If you're trying to build a chat, for example, or something similar, you use something like JMS. So everything has its use cases, and to Keshav's point, you obviously need to understand your team and what they've been comfortable with in the past, and how they've developed their development backgrounds.
Yep.
All right, guys. So moving on here. Let's see. There's a question. OAS 3.0. Is it hard to learn? What's the best way to get started?
Yep. It's so for just some context. So the Open API specification is the world standard in defining RESTful interfaces. And when I mean defining RESTful interface, all it does, the Open API specification, is it defines what is it that this API does, some metadata about that, what are the various resources that this API exposes, and the associated requests and responses for each of these resources, right? And it's because it's in it's for RESTful industry, it's for the RESTful world. That includes some of the HTTP methods like get, put, post, delete. And under each of these methods, we will be defining what are the requests and responses. The cool thing about the Open API specification is that it is completely it's not based on code. It's actually anyone can understand it. How you can understand what this API does and what this API is supposed to do. And the other thing about the Open API specification is that it's also machine readable. So with just just by defining this API interface, you're actually making this both human consumable as well as making it consumable for machines as well. So meaning applications can consume this, parse this, read it, create test cases, create monitors, document the API, etc. There's a huge ecosystem and jobs that you can be accomplishing by just defining your API with the Open API spec. So, Tamil, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, definitely. So not only is it easy to get started. There's tools out there. There's free tools. There's commercial tools that will help you get started. And there's so much benefit in using something like OAS 3.0, right? You get the interactive documentation to expose to your consumers. You'll get code snippets if you're working on design first approach. You save time in development. So there's so much aggregated value that you get to using a framework like OAS 3. So we definitely push that, and we evangelize Swagger and OAS 3.
Yep. And so coming back to the question of like how do you get started with the Open API specification? Agreed, it is a framework, and there is a learning curve associated with it. Luckily, there's some great resources that exist in the interwebs. There's if you go to the swagger.io website, so swagger.io/docs, we actually have some really comprehensive documentation on just how to define an API using the Open API specification. There's also a great tutorial by the API handyman, Arnaud Loret. He is actually one of a key influencer in the API space, and so he's built out a great comprehensive tutorial as well on like how do you get started with Open API 3.0. So those two resources I highly recommend. And I do remember like about a couple of months ago we also have published a YouTube video, SmartBear, it's a company, and we talk about how you actually get started using the Open API 3.0. So just type in how to use Open API 3.0 on YouTube, and you should probably stumble onto the SmartBear video as well.
And if you guys want some examples, definitely visit our commercial product, swaggerhub.com. It's free to try out and look at, and there's users that expose their APIs, and you could start traversing through them and start to see them right in there. All right, so this is actually a very important question that I see everybody moving towards and trying to apply, right? So the question is from Jack, and he's asking best practices in moving towards microservices-based architecture. And again, this is something that we see in the industry today, right? Everybody or companies that are a little bit older, right, that are trying to catch up or to transform to digital, right? They have these monolithic approaches to software, and it's difficult to maintain and keep up with all these legacy systems. So what we're seeing is a trend where they're actually breaking down these monolithic systems and building microservices around different parts of that software, right, of that core legacy system. And I believe that a great way, and again, not to plug again, but it definitely, following good documentation, good design approaches, and integrating with open source tooling is definitely something that we see over and over.
Yep.
Being able to reuse assets from one part of the business to the next will also be key within moving from monolithic approach to a more microservices approach.
Yep.
What do you think, Keshav?
Yeah, I think you hit all the right points, Tamil. I would also add that microservices actually help you isolate failures very, very easily, right? And so as your product scales, especially as your user base grows as well, there'll be so many times when even a small failure in your application could impact thousands of lives, right? There's aircraft carriers which have microservice-based architecture. Right. Streaming companies like Netflix, for example, use the microservice-based architecture, and it's important for them. Like every time you watch The Office on Netflix, and if it has even a 10-second delay, you're frustrated, right? They know the business impact for delays are huge, right? So microservices actually help you isolate the services which aren't functioning as they're supposed to, and go in and actually fix them ASAP. So coming back to the question of like how do you actually move effectively towards the microservices based architecture, I would say there's two components to this. Again, I always bring it up, which is one is identifying your technology stack. Well, take it back. There's three components to this: identifying your technology stack, identifying your business taxonomy, and the third is making sure that your company's culture aligns with your long-term view of getting into microservices, right? Because microservices is a long-term endeavor. It is not something which is, especially when you're migrating, it's not something which is like, all right, it's not going to take a sprint or two. It is an endeavor. You need to be invested in this. So firstly, make sure from a technology stack perspective, you are well equipped to get into a microservices-based architecture. So that includes, for example, being able to isolate certain services, being able to make sure that your all of these different services expose their data to an API.
That's right.
Usually, it's a REST API in today's world. That's what I'm seeing, at least. REST API. So having a common interface for these different services to communicate with each other, right? That's important. Then there's, of course, exploring your business taxonomy, and what I mean by that is making sure that you actually identify the business bounds, right? So if you're building a payment service, right, you need to know that there's going to be an account service, there's going to be the iframe service, right? There's the e-commerce billing service, right? There's all of these different bounds, and so anytime you build a new service, you need to make sure that those services align with the bounds of your business.
That's right.
Right. And finally is, of course, the culture. Make sure that everyone knows what microservices is. Educate your teammates. Educate the people who directly report to you on the benefits of microservices, and also how to effectively get started with. There's amazing consultants, great YouTube videos online.
That's right. And to add a little more to that, you just reminded me with your second point. Your monolithic service is going to be parsed out into different parts, which means that if one development team or one part is working on a particular service and it depends on multiple services, you might be stuck at some point, either in development, in the testing phase, and this is where service virtualization plays a huge role, right? Picking a way to easily map out, mock out, mimic these existing services will also be a key part of moving towards a microservices approach.
Yeah.
All right, so we have a question from CD Productions. Where is the best place to host an API?
Best place to host an API. I would say, again, this is there's no best place, right? I'm gonna say that up front. It really depends on, again, what are your business cases, and what are you trying to achieve with your API. So let's take a couple of examples. So say, for example, your API is going to be consumed by 3 internal developers. In that case, the fastest and easiest way, and also the cheapest way to get started, is by just spinning up an AWS server, for example, hosting your API definitions and documentation on that server, putting in the right authorization, if it's only 3 developers and they're internal, and just getting started with it, right? That's a place for you to start hosting your API definitions. If, for example, if you want to move much more faster, and if you don't have the time to spin up an AWS server, for example, you can use some tools which abstract that hosting for you, like Swagger Hub, for example, where you can just host the API definition. It auto-generates the documentation, makes it interactive for you. If, say, for example, you're looking at more like a public-facing API, which has hundreds of thousands of consumers potentially, or like a partner-based economy where they're paying you money to make transactions through your API, right, that's where it becomes important for you to start thinking about developer portals as well, right? So developer portals are essentially like this one-stop shop to get started with your API, getting the right authorization keys, the authentication methods, some getting started tutorials, and some really good comprehensive documentation, because that's when your APIs become very, very business critical, and they also put your company's reputation on the line, because they're front and center of your product strategy. So that's where developer portals are important, and there are some great developer portal tools out there. You can also build out developer portals. It does take some time, but I know there are many companies which have done that in the past as well. And of course, there are tools which help you abstract that.
Yeah, definitely agree 100% with everything you said there. Again, developer portals not only make your API accessible and easy to maintain, but you want to be able to give your public a place where they can try out APIs, where they can see how it works real time, right? And that's exactly what these services will do for you.
Yep.
So hopefully that answered your question there. And again, guys, if you have further asks about or further parts of what we're saying and what you've seen from your questions, please feel free to add on the chat below. All right, so there's another question here. How is virtualization important from my APIs, and how do I get started with service virtualization? Towards your previous questions. I think you mean towards our previous answers, but anyway, towards that, there's a lot of tools out there, and again, that depends on the scale of what you want to build out. Okay, so if you want to stub out, a sample response, there's a lot of open source tooling out there that will help you. If you want to build something a little bit more advanced and you don't have the development resources, we have actually SmartBear has a tool called Service V that allows you to virtualize an API fairly easily with a definition, with navigating over an existing API and multiple other places. So that I definitely recommend it. We have some level functionality in the open source tooling as well in SoapUI open source that will allow you to stand up a virtual asset and expose it so that again you're not stuck in your development process when you're depending on a third-party API or on an internal API that's not available.
Yep. And I think just adding to that, the real implications of service virtualization comes in this approach called the API first approach, where essentially you're starting with your API layer before even building out the backend implementation, building out the database models, or think about your front end clients. You start with your API layer, or your API's definition. Right, and once you have your definition in place, as Tamil mentioned, you can take the Open API definition and spin out word servers and mocks for those different definition layers. Now with this, what happens is now you're giving some data points for your front end developers to start building their front end clients without any dependencies on their back end implementation. They don't have to wait for your back end developers to come in, build out the data model, build out the API's implementation, work on the business logic. Right, it's actually you're working together. So the back end team can start working on the back end implementation, and the front end teams can start working on integrating the front end clients with the mock data which is given by that API layer. So this just reduces any sort of interdependencies and makes for faster delivery to the market.
That's right. So that's a very good point. That's one very important use case when you may need to follow virtualization. When you do a API first approach, right? When you design APIs, you can have your developers, your testers, your architects working all in parallel, as you just mentioned. So that's a very good use case. I've seen myself a bunch of other use cases in the industry. Again, microservices is a huge part where you would need service virtualization. Also, if you're dependent on third-party APIs and you incur charge when you're performance testing your integrations, that's a very good use case for virtualization as well. Anyways, let's get over to this next question. When do I build APIs in GraphQL? So that's actually a very good point.
Yeah, good question, Roger. I mean, one of the questions which I see ask a lot, people, GraphQL is creating a lot of buzz in the industry, and that's the reality of it, and they are supported by some big players in the industry, including Facebook, and they have built some great tooling. I would say, GraphQL is great, and we need to always consider it, but also ask yourself, what are you trying to accomplish? Always, fundamentally, it's physics first principles is what are you trying to do over here, right? What is the fundamental objective of your API? And a lot of times, you'll realize that REST can actually be REST is much faster to implement, and it has a lot of great out-of-box capabilities. GraphQL becomes really important for a couple of use cases. One is when you say, for example, when you have a lot of when anytime you put in a request for an API that's really, really long and you have to string in a lot of information in that API request, that's when you could potentially move to Graph, which makes querying data much more easier. Say, for example, if you want to get back one blog post title and say the 10 comments associated with that blog post, right? If you could potentially, it should potentially ideally happen in just one request. But if every single time when you make that request, if say as you expand into different clients, if you're throwing down payload data associated with that request, that's when REST is not really effective. So say in that specific example of having one blog post with 10 comments, it works great for say the desktop, right? You use the REST API endpoint, you get in that data, and it works great. Now say you want to build a mobile app, like an Android application, and in that case, you can only use 5 comments. There's no space for 10 comments, right? And that means every time you're making that REST call, you're throwing 5 comments down the drain. That data is not useful, right? And this is just for one specific endpoint. As you scale across different front-end clients, you will always have that issue, right? And as your payload and as your data becomes more robust and more, I would say, interdependent with other data, this becomes a bigger problem to handle. And so that's when GraphQL can be really effective is the ability to query different data points that you're exposing from your API through your API. Versioning also actually becomes much more simpler in GraphQL, unlike REST. You don't have to deprecate entire endpoints. With GraphQL, you can actually deprecate specific values and focus on other values within that same API. So that also is actually a really powerful feature in Graph.
Yeah, so I think, like you said, right, you scale a little bit better, right? You don't pull all this data that you don't need. You pull specific parts, payloads that you need, right? That's part of what GraphQL allows you to do. And obviously, maintenance become also easier. You don't have to deprecate full versions of an endpoint. You can deprecate parts of it. So definitely, there sounds like there's a lot of value there. It does have a very specific use cases, and again, that's having very large payloads. Right. Okay, so we have about 5 minutes left, folks. So definitely, bring up, your questions, and if you want further comments on what we've already answered, feel free to let us know. Definitely make it a debate. If you guys don't agree with something, let us know. We're more than happy to go further into details. So I have a question here. How do I authorize an API and monitoring access? So I think they're asking about how they can actually capture and monitor API usage statistics. The question is a little bit vague, and it's a little hard to understand. Hopefully, again, this is what I think it is. So if you have something a little bit different, definitely let us know. But I think the best way to monitor API access and understand usage statistics is via API gateways. I believe there's really no other easy way to do that, right? API gateways will give you the capability of understanding how your API has been being used, what endpoints have the most hit on, and you can capture statistics very, very easily. And this is, where building APIs becomes essential, and where SmartBear will actually, help you with tools that we have in integrated environments like Swagger Hub. You can start designing your API and push them out to existing API gateways like Apigee, Azure, and a bunch of other API gateways. So definitely the answer to that, I believe, is API gateways, right? Easy ways to view statistics. Do you have anything to add there?
No, I think API gateways, again, when there's an existing solution out there, use that. Don't try to build homegrown solutions unless you're very confident and have the time to build that. Totally agree. API gateway solutions are a great way to monitor access, monitor usage. Again, that is a monitoring capability, like Alert Site, for example, which is a tool we built, allows you to monitor usage, not necessarily access. Make sure that the API is functioning and works in the right environment. And so, I think there's definitely big use cases for that, and gateways and monitoring tools can definitely help you in that front.
All right, so somebody's asking, is it really efficient to do performance load testing on separate APIs rather than doing it for the whole software? All from so that's a question from Sofian. Hopefully I'm saying your name correctly. I think it is, right? If you think about it, we talked about microservices where we see the industry moving. And not the whole API or not the whole service or not the whole application is being used in a similar manner. So it is a good idea to strategically parse out, the whole application, the APIs and everything, and so not only will you be able to replicate the real usage of the systems, but you will also be able to get concise data off when doing this, right? If you test a part of it, you know how it works, you know how it works at scale, you know when it fails and why it fails. If you test your whole application, something might fail, then you will need to go down and debug further, and it's just a difficult motion of doing these things.
Yep. Agreed. I totally agree with you. I think, and especially as your API product portfolio increases, right, making sure that all these different data points work and work effectively and work as intended is really important and should be a part of your testing strategy.
So Praveen is asking where UDDI and WSDL comes into play. Praveen, I'm not sure what UDDI is, so if you can expand a little bit on that. But WSDL is basically a descriptor for a SOAP web service. It basically identifies what the web service does, its operations, its requests, its schema. And again, I wouldn't say it's a human readable format like Swagger is for the more modern RESTful APIs, but there's still tools, machines that can go out there and take that WSDL and outline every single method or operation from that SOAP service, and things like SOAP UI, you will easily be able to build out test cases for the less technical folks in the audience.
Yep.
So hopefully that helps out, Praveen.
Is WSDL written in XML?
It is. So WSDL definitely is written in XML only. Praveen, again, and if you want to expand a little on UDDI, feel free to. It looks like we have a bunch of questions here that we have not answered, unfortunately, but reach out to us separately. Reach out to our Twitter account.
Yeah. My Twitter handle is KeshinPoint, KESHINPOINT.
And mine is at Tamil. That's at TEMIL. So definitely reach out to us and let us know.
Name's so great, you gotta say it twice.
Thank you for joining us today. Again, this was our second AMA. Hopefully we have more of these, and we're really glad that people are really interactive in these. So definitely keep coming, guys. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.